His mother just stroked his head again and said, "Your father wants everyone to sleep here in the hall tonight, where it is easy to keep a guard. I've brought you a cloak, and you can tuck up right here on the bench." Leaf's eyes opened wide. In excitement, "A guard," he said. "Oh, Mother, let me help." "You sleep," said the mother. "That will be the best help. In the morning, there will be enough for everyone to do." "Are we going away?" "Yes." She reached out and touched a great carved pillar that ran up to support the roof beam. "We must leave Trondheim now and find a new home." She bent down and kissed him. "Now go to sleep." He lay down on the bench, and she covered him with a long woolen cloak she had brought. "Mother," he said, rolling over to look up at her, "where are we going?" "It's in this northwest district, only that your father is outlawed," his mother told him. "We'll go south first to our friends in Stenche." And she then said, "We will see. Perhaps we shall settle near them. Or perhaps we'll go to the great north." Leaf asked, "Perhaps to Ireland?" "Perhaps," his mother nodded slowly. "Brendan would like that, I must tell him. He says Ireland is very green." Leaf said, as if he were talking to himself, "And there on great trees there are trees also here. I like to see trees growing sometimes, not just scrubby little bushes like here in Iceland. You will see them soon perhaps. Go to sleep now." And again, 1,000 years ago, people were so nomadic, different cultures. And usually the number one reason why people were nomadic was as soon as they exhausted the resources and the food supply of wild animals and so forth, they would have to gather up all their belongings and move. And sometimes they even brought the building parts of their lodge with them to a new destination. The mother said to Leaf, "Go to sleep now." "All right." Beneath the cloak, Leaf felt for the hilt of his dagger, and that in his hand he fell asleep. And here we have Bajanari at a post all night long, and the rest of Eric's men took turns patrolling the yards outside, listening for the sound of horses' hooves to warn them of approaching danger. And all night long Eric sat staring into the fire while the housefolk slept around him, planning, pondering, thinking of the lands where the Norse folk had settled, balancing this one against that. There were Norway and Ireland and England. The islands of the Viking ships lay in their harbors. The Norse had traveled to lands as far east as Russia, where the great city had been built by the men from the north, and a Viking king ruled in Kiev. Eric thought of lands to the south along the coast of Europe, past Spain and round into the Mediterranean, where the island of Sicily was a Norse stronghold. Vikings had sailed to the very end of the inland sea, where they now guarded the Eastern Emperor himself in the Byzantium. At last, as the cocks crowed for dawn, Eric knew that his enemies would not come that night, and he lay down and slept. Next morning there was a great bustle. In those days a man of wealth, and Eric was a leader among men, could not put a checkbook and a roll of bills in his pocket and ride off. Gold rings linked together and coins from the southern lands where the Vikings plundered and traded might serve as money. But much wealth was in cattle, sheep, and horses. Eric proposed to leave nothing behind him to fall into the hands of his enemies. The cattle and sheep were gathered from pasture and stall and driven down to the water, where a small but stout ship was pulled up to the beach to take them aboard. And again, the Vikings were seafarers, so transportation was by a Viking ship. And in the very beginning of the book, it talks about how Leif and Brandon were sitting on the edge of a shoreline. So for them to get a quick getaway, it would have to be by a Viking ship. So again, nothing was to be left behind, and the stout ship was pulled up to the beach to take them aboard. Leif's mother and the baby were to travel in this ship south across the bay to a safe location with most of the slaves. Spears and swords were placed under the afterdeck, and beneath them 2 leather bags of gold and silver. 2 of Eric's most trusted men traveled with his wife to command the ship and bring her safe to friends in the southern part of Iceland, where the family planned first to take refuge. Eric and the larger part of his band of men-at-arms planned to ride eastward round the head of the ford with the horses and join his wife in 3 or 4 days. Leif, of course, was to go with his mother. Now this did not suit Leif at all. To sail south in safety in the company of a lowing herd of cattle seemed a very dull way for a boy who owned a dagger of his own to leave his home. So Leif sought out Brendan while they hallooed at the cows to drive them out into the water where they could be hoisted aboard the ship. The 2 boys planned to vanish. It should not be a hard matter to hide until the ship should have cast off and be on her way. They climbed aboard accordingly and jumped about the waist of the vessel. At last, the men in charge of loading the cattle told them sternly to get out of the way anywhere they wanted, in the name of the gods of Thor and Odin, but out of the way. And so they did. They hid. Then they slipped down into the water over the stern of the ship and swam and waded ashore behind a tongue of rock that ran out into the bay. Dripping, they made their way back into the barnyard and hid under a pile of hay in one of the stables. Eric was not pleased at all when the ship safely beated out into the deep water with slaves at the oars. The boys appeared. "You pair of imps," he cried. "Your mother will think you're lost, Leif." "Oh, we left word," said Leif. "Brendan's little sister knows we're with you. She'll tell Mother." "So, I have to look after you?" said Eric. "You're a nuisance. We have to ride hard." "We'll look after ourselves, and we can ride hard, can't we, Brandon?" Brandon nodded vehemently. "Come then, up with you," said Eric. Making the best of things, the boys mounted 2 shaggy ponies, and in the center of the cavalcade they started off. It was too long a trip for the horses to be galloped, and the band of armed men and 2 wet boys rode at a bone-shaking jog-trot over the rough country. As soon as they were a fair distance from the farm, Eric struck inland away from the road they would be expected to follow. In that northern country, right up under the Arctic Circle, the sun hardly set, and it was not until 10 at night that they had halted. Up to that time, they had stopped only to change horses or chew a bit of smoked meat. They were in wild country, and the mountains of the northwest peninsula of Iceland were still to their north. The first night they camped in the ruins of a deserted farmhouse, which had been burned down to its foundation stones. Eric looked about it grimly, thinking of what might await the home he had left behind. But he wasted little time on regret for what he could not help, and soon, wrapped in his cloak, he slept beside the 2 exhausted boys. Next day, Leif could hardly stay awake in his saddle. His knees arched from gripping his pony, his teeth jolted together. He was sore all over. Brendan, too, was white under the tan of his skin. But the boys knew they must not delay the men in their push to safety out of this district. Here's Eric's enemies could now attack him without fear, since he was protected by no law. So again, Leif could hardly stay awake in his saddle. This was a new experience. So Eric told himself, I must stay awake. Leif thought, I must stay awake. He imagined himself pitching from his pony under the hooves of the horses behind him, and he did not like that thought. Yes, said Brendan between his teeth. Are you sleepy, too? Brendan, he grasped. Brendan, are you sleepy? Brendan said, we must talk to stay awake. What shall we talk about? Let's tell stories, said Leif. We're going to finish the story right there, and we'll resume on part 3 in the next episode of the book called The Viking, written by Elizabeth Janeway. And again, this is the first time I've ever read this book. I did get some of the names confused, but I hope that you can understand how difficult it is to read a book by video. This is a new experience for me. And to finish up, I would like to read a poem. As I drift, floating among the clouds in the sky, I see the stars are closer now that I am so high. The moon shines on the trees, the waves, and me, as I whisper with the wind so far above the sea. As I glide among the heavens, too light to care, the burden of life becomes too heavy to bear. As the link to my soul stretches thin through the sky, I know I have nothing to live for, but no reason to die. I consider the shape of my destiny. I hover on the brink of being free. Yearningly I strain, wanting just once to touch the moon, knowing my soul will not bathe in her illumination again soon. Resolutely I turn my back for a time on the stars, facing again the world of hypocrites, gangs, and bars. Walking on moon rays, floating in starlight, free in the night, I return to live in the daylight. By LBJ. And again, this book of poetry is called Poetry by LBJ, and you can look it up on Etsy.com, Wild Trout Lily. And Forget Me Not, please come back to the video programs given by GinGee GoodEarth on YouTube videos. And without further ado, everybody have a nice weekend and keep up on current events, because it's so important to know not just about your own community, your neighborhood, but obviously keep abreast to what's going on around the world. And as a tip, I do receive the Epoch Times newspaper, which comes every Wednesday, once a week, in your mailbox all over the world. And it's not very expensive, but it really gives you a detailed map of history, current events, and it has special sections for password puzzles, and it has a special page on children, news and games and cartoons. I strongly suggest that you make a small investment in Epoch Times newspaper news, and you can research that on the internet. But in times when life seems unbearable, not maybe for yourself, if you have a healthy stance, but when you hear about other people having such difficulty with illness that has stressed them to an extent where they perish, we have to buckle up and realize that we all have to take a part of this history and make our lives healthy and wise, and work hard every day on learning how to succeed in a world that has problems that have to be faced. So what I like to say to finish up is that we have terrific challenges on survival. And one way to get through this is to educate yourselves, maintain a healthy